What's good in the hood, YouTube? This is Crazy Samurai 71 here, bringing you guys another video. Today I'm bringing you guys a video on Kamen Rider. This video will be focused on Kamen Rider Gyo. For those who do not know, Kamen Rider Gyo is spelled Kamen Rider and then it's Z-I-O, but it's pronounced with a J. Just so that if anyone isn't clear why I'm calling it that, now you understand. So, anyway, this is for the episode 1 review, and the episode is called Kingdom 2068. So what we end up seeing in this episode is it starts off with us seeing Gyo. Oma has to do with the fact that he is this overlord character now. He is like a king rather than just the standard Gyo. So in this future, we end up seeing him as this evil ruler who basically rules with an iron fist. He's able to destroy people, buildings, destroy objects, just using his hands and putting them out into the air. He doesn't even have to do anything. He's merely able to just conjure energy and just force people to be destroyed. At the same time, there's this whole throne setup where we end up seeing his first transformation on display for his human form, and also a bunch of rider statues, which is really cool. He managed to destroy several people that are trying to take him out, and then what happens is that we end up seeing a character that becomes important in this episode's friend or someone that they know of being destroyed by him. So clearly things are not good in this time period. Then what happens is that we end up seeing that this is being seen through a visual lens of the past, where the person that is going to be Kamen Rider Gyo ends up seeing his evil overlord self. So it's his first chance to see himself in the future. Following this, the theme song plays, which the theme song, I gotta say this much right now, the song itself I like a lot. When they first were showcasing the theme, they had like a different clip other than the actual video for it, which that clip, if it was gonna be the actual theme song video, I would have been very unhappy, but fortunately the opening video actually looks pretty good. I'm actually pretty happy about the video portion, so that's good. As far as things go from here, what we do end up seeing is that we end up seeing the character that's going to play Kamen Rider Gyo, which I'm now going to say basically who he is. So the character's name is Sugo Takiwa, which I'll just be calling him Sugo. So anyway, what ends up happening is that Sugo is just heading up to his house, which he ends up being confronted by a guy that goes to a karate school, ask him, what's his plans, and he mentions that I told you before, I'm planning on becoming a king. That's really his goal in life. He wants to become a king, and everyone that's his age, he's supposed to be a third year in high school, is trying to practice for this entrance exam to get into a major profession. These exams could lead to him taking on a very different path, but he's so focused on that he thinks he doesn't need to take these exams at all. So that's something to note. And the person that speaks to him actually throws him and thinks he's just crazy for thinking the way he does. So that's something to note. Now, what does end up happening is that eventually Sugo ends up heading into his house, which is actually a clock shop. His uncle, who his name is Junichiro, is the one that he lives with, and Junichiro is gonna fix I believe it was supposed to be like a microwave or a toaster, or no, it was a radio. I'm sorry, it was a radio. I was trying to think what it was. It was a radio, and the thing is that Junichiro wants Sugo to take the entrance exams, but is understanding of his nephew, and is respectful of him. That's something to note. He wants to give him some course information, but at the same time he's so fixed on becoming this king that it's a harder discussion. It's something that he's not really all that in favor of, which is a little bit interesting. Now, what does end up happening is that eventually he ends up leaving his house and he ends up going out. What we do end up seeing as well, prior to him actually entering the clock shop, is that there is this big robot that is following him. what actually ends up happening is that as Sugo is riding off on his bike, he ends up being confronted by this hooded figure, which we later end up learning his identity. But he basically warns Sugo of a red robot, and he suddenly disperses at that point. What also happens is that earlier in the episode, he ends up finding the ride watch, which ends up being on top of his bike. So he doesn't know what it is at first, and it's really just a mystery. But as he's heading off after confronting this mysterious figure, what happens is that he ends up being approached by that big red robot that was mentioned, that like, be aware of it. And this robot is the time machine for a certain character that will end up learning his identity a little bit later. So I'm not going to go into it right away. Now, what does end up happening is that he's being chased, he's using his bike, he's trying to run away, and he's having a lot of trouble dealing with this big robot. What ends up happening is that eventually we end up seeing this other character that rescues him that has another one of those big robots called the Time Machines. And what happens is that she ends up rescuing him, putting him in the time machine, and they end up traveling to the Cretaceous period. Cretaceous period in time, meaning that there's dinosaurs around. So he actually ends up in the time of the dinosaurs and is confronted by a T-Rex where he has to run away from it. And then they end up escaping from that time period to 1671. Why that time period, not exactly sure, but that's where they go to. What ends up happening is that in that time period, this female character is introduced. Her name is Tsukiyomi, and what happens is that I believe they discuss at this point the whole story and why he's there, basically describing the fact that they end up going to get a meal, and they discuss that in the future, in the year 2068, where she comes from, there's this evil overlord that is supposed to be his future self, and he ends up ruling the world with an iron fist, and people despise him greatly, and he is seen as this evil person. The thing is that Sugo's unsure as to whether or not it really is him, but the thing is that she basically confirms it's him by basically saying his name, his how old he is, when he was born, what he's good at subject-wise, what he's bad at, just a number of details that basically give away clear information that she knows stuff about him. Thing is that following this, the rider watch appears, and he still can't use it. It's still not in use. But what happens is that Tsukiyomi says that this device will allow you to gain incredible power. And what happens is that it's not in working condition at least right now. But then what happens is that there's a fight going on in the town, and what happens is that she tries to stop the fight and pretends to be Sugo, and what actually happens is that he ends up saying, "I don't like fighting, you guys should stop." And what happens is that those guys end up lifting him and throwing him into a river, and so then they stop fighting, and he's happy after he gets out that they stopped fighting, at least, even though he got wet. And everyone else looks at him like he's some crazy kid that's silly or dumb, and it's interesting. So what does end up happening is that from here, what we do end up seeing is that the character from before that was in the red robot appears. He is transformed, and that is Kamen Rider Gaze. Gaze, his name is Gaze, and his character, his last name, if you're wondering what it is Myoko N. And as far as things go, that's all we know about him. We know his name, and he's trying to, and the idea is that Tsukiyomi and Gaze are trying to prevent Sugo from becoming Oma Zio. They want to make sure that he becomes good, or just basically stops him from becoming Kamen Rider Zio entirely. So that's an important detail. Now, what does end up happening is that they do try to attack. He ends up using his time machine, and then what happens is that Tsukiyomi and Sugo end up using their time machines to travel to a different time period. They actually travel to the year 2017, and what happens is that as Sugo enters that time period, it's snowing, and they end up seeing a Smash Monster from Kamen Rider Build. Following this, we end up seeing a vortex finish that occurs with Kamen Rider Build and Kamen Rider Cross Z. And what happens is that eventually, after they fight the Smash, Build and Cross Z de-transform, and they reveal their identities to Sugo. Then they end up returning to the cafe, which was from Kamen Rider Build, and they end up discussing things. Sento has no idea what this ride watch is, and is completely clueless, which makes a lot of sense. But what does end up happening is that he also ends up seeing the refrigerator that allows him to travel through it. And what ends up happening is that eventually, because they're interacting with each other, Tsukuyomi appears and knocks all three of them out, making it so that basically they forget about each other, because it's tampering with a time period. Yet at the same time, what also ends up happening is that this also allows Sugo to experience his first encounter, learning of what the Kamen Riders are. So that's important to note as well. So then he is brought to the present day, Sugo, back to the year 2018, where he speaks to his uncle about what happened to him, and about him becoming an evil overlord and all that. And his uncle basically says, it's your choice as to whether or not you choose to take a chance on something where you could reach your goal. And for him, he never was able to really do what he wanted to do, but it might be Sugo's chance to do something like that. And Sugo is interested in it. Eventually, what does end up happening is that in the meantime, we end up seeing this other character known as Wool. And I never actually say in this episode the character's name, but his name is Wool. And what happens is that there's a guy that's supposed to be hit by a car, but what happens is that Wool stops time, and he says, I'm giving you this chance. If you want to, normally you would have died right now, but if you want to be alive, if you want to be kept alive, you must do a contract with me and work with me if you want to stay alive. And the thing is, the guy's like pretty much desperate and wants to do it because it's like, I either die or I don't die. And so in this case, what happens is that he takes advantage of that, and he ends up giving him a ride watch. This ride watch is another rider ride watch. Another riders are something that this season is going to be using a lot of, which basically they're another version of the Kamen Rider from that specific season. So in other words, in this case, Wool ends up giving this guy the Another Rider Build ride watch. And what happens is that he ends up giving it to him, and he ends up taking the form of Another Rider Build. And in this case, what happens is that his abilities allow him to use bottles to suck up people and turn them into bottles, because his goal is that he wants to find best matches. And so what happens is that he ends up getting two people sucked up, which turn into a karate bottle and a tennis bottle, both of which never existed prior to now, but it's still interesting to see that. Now, what does end up happening is that eventually Sugo ends up heading into town, and he ends up seeing this another rider in the town. He wants to stop it and fight back, and what happens is that at that point, the ride watch activates properly, and he's able to use the ride watch. He ends up doing his first transformation, which is cool to see, and it even flashes back to the statue commemorating his first transformation, and he transforms into Kamen Rider Gyo. At this point, he ends up fighting him. We do end up seeing the Ziku driver and also the Ziku Glade, which is his weapon, and it's pretty cool to see all that happen. Following the defeat of Another Build, what happens is that guy just turns back into a normal human. It's not clear as to whether or not he's in good health or what happens to the people after that, but he turns back to being a human. And then following this, what ends up happening is that Gaze appears again. Gaze at this point decides to transform, and keep in mind this as well, the one that actually gave him his Ziku driver was Woes. Woes was the hooded figure that we saw earlier in the episode. He basically presented him the Ziku driver, and he wanted him to become an evil overlord. But what happens is that Sugo says that I will become an overlord, but I will become one that is loved and praised, not one that is hated. So he wants to change fate while still becoming this king. He wants to become a king, but one that's liked. And that's the big difference here. He is not looking to be the same kind of king that Omazeo is. So that's a big, big difference. So then what happens is that, as I was saying, Gaze appears. He ends up transforming, which is cool to see his first transformation in the show, at least, even though we've already seen him at this point. And then he also ends up using a second ride watch, because the Ziku driver has it where you can put 2 ride watches, one on each side. And so what happens is that he ends up putting a ghost ride watch on the other side, so he's able to transform and gain the armor for Kamen Rider Ghost. This transformation allows him to unlock that form, and what happens is that using the icons that are on his shoulders, he's able to release the rider jackets that allow him to take the different forms, and they begin to follow after Dio. What we do see that's going to happen in the next episode, because basically this is where the episode ends, is that we will be seeing Sento again and also Ryoga. There should be a fight that will occur with Gaze, Gazio, Sento, and Ryoga going up against an enemy. It's not clear as to who that is yet, but it's still pretty cool. And things are just going to be very interesting. Next episode we'll also introduce Build's armor form. Keep in mind this, we're going to be seeing it on Zio, but as far as the rider, as far as the armor goes, the armor can be interchanged between Gaze and Zio. So in other words, Geo can use the ghost armor and Gaze can use the build armor. Both of them can use it. It's just that it changes based on the kanji on their faces, and just certain things are a little bit different, but generally speaking, either one of them can use any of the ride watches, which is good to know. I wasn't sure if that was something that could happen or if it was one-sided. I'm also going to be curious to see if secondary riders will be shown off in the show or if they're just going to be specific to the merchandise. We don't really know yet if we're going to be seeing the Crossy ride watch in the show. We know that it's going to be something that's going to be in toy sales, because right now the early sales of the Ziku driver, if you buy it, it will actually come with the Crossy ride watch, so just keep that in mind. So that's about it. I'd love to know your guys' opinions about this episode. Did you enjoy it? What did you think of Kamen Rider Dio? What do you think of Kamen Rider Gaze? Do you think that Omazeo is Sugo, or do you think it's someone else? I personally think it's someone else, and a lot of people have been suspecting that, so I'm very curious to know who it's going to be, and how did that character become who he is. Definitely something to look forward to finding out. And there's also more of those characters like Wool and Woes that we'll be seeing, and those characters are called the I forget what the Time Jackers, right? So we'll end up seeing that and more. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. So until then, guys, I'm Crazy Samurai 71, and goodbye, guys.